Happy Pride to all who celebrate in Gaza. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of the Israel-Hamas war. I feel like we should talk about it, feel like we should dive in, because in the last week, a lot of things happened that I feel like should be talked about. The president gave a speech, which we'll get into in just a second, but also several countries came out recently and said that Palestine should be a recognized state. Specifically, Spain, Norway, and Ireland recognized Palestine as a nation state, which brings some questions. Now, I haven't really talked, obviously, a ton, especially recently, about the Israeli-Hamas war, which I think is what you should call it. I don't think you should call it the Israeli-Palestine war for lots of other reasons that we won't need to get into right now. But remember, Israel's fighting a terrorist organization. And you can argue over what kind of funding the U.S. should give them. You can argue over a bunch of the different nuances in it. But overall, remember, there's a country with Western values in which all people are respected equally, and then there's a terrorist organization, and if you have trouble deciding which sides of those to pick, I don't know what to tell you. And like I said, if you really are struggling there, especially if you're part of the alphabet community, keep in mind that the alphabet community in that part of the world, Gaza, and in the West Bank, and really in all of the Middle East, is not as accepted as you might think, which shouldn't need to be stated, but is just reality. But back to the point of, and I think that there's a small point to be made here, but back to the idea of these several states, nation states, now saying, well, Palestine needs to be recognized as its own country. We, as a country, are going to recognize them. There's some issues with that. Like I said, what countries were those? Spain, Norway, and Ireland recently recognized Palestine as a nation state. The main point, the main question that needs to be asked here is, what changed? Because prior to that, those countries did not recognize Palestine as its own nation state. And by Palestine in this particular situation, I think we mean the West Bank, and I think we mean Gaza. To be honest with you, I didn't really try and figure out which side they were talking about, either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, but I think it overall is kind of the same thing. If you're going to recognize them as a nation state, what changed? What changed in your view if you weren't doing it before and now you're going to do it? Was it the fact that October 7th, the horrible atrocities committed by Hamas, were justified in your mind? Do you think that it made so much of a difference that now you're willing to say, oh, the Palestinian regions, Gaza and the West Bank, are now recognized by us? In other words, did Hamas's attack that killed 1,500 people on October 7th work? Is that what you're doing? Are you giving them credit? Which is a weird position to be in, especially for countries who call themselves civilized Western countries, to then recognize a nation state that is quote-unquote Palestine, and again, I don't know what their definition of that is, to say, well, we now recognize that as a state would inherently then mean that something changed. And then if it inherently means that something changed, you have to ask yourself, what changed? Well, an unwarranted attack on innocent civilians that killed 1,500 people, that changed. That's really kind of the big thing that changed. And if that's the thing if that was the catalyst that changed your mind, what does that say about you? Imagine, if you will, a situation in which, I don't know, let's just make up a person's name. John Hinckley. I don't know, let's make up a name. He's trying to impress somebody named, another made-up person, Jodie Foster. And he wrote letters to this Jodie Foster saying, please accept me. This made-up person, John Hinckley, is Palestine in this situation. And all of these other Western countries will categorize as this made-up person named Jodie Foster. And this guy, John Hinckley, writes letters, just a ton of letters to this Jodie Foster person, and she says no. Well, she doesn't say no, she just ignores it because this was an unhinged person. And so then this made-up character named John Hinckley says, well, I know what'll get this star actress's attention. I will attempt to assassinate the President of the United States of America. And then he goes off and tries to do that, and fortunately, thank God, is unsuccessful. And imagine then, if you will, Jodie Foster this made-up person that represents the Western states that now are saying, well, we should recognize Palestine as a country, and Palestine being represented by this guy, made-up John Hinckley, then says, wow, this atrocity that you committed sure has gotten my attention. Maybe I'll give this guy a try. Maybe he is the one for me. Now that I have been made aware of the lengths that he would go to swoon me, that maybe now is the time that I finally give this guy a shot. Go on a date with him. Because this can't be a horrible way to justify horrendous actions at all whatsoever. But I think that's what this situation is like. It really, there's a lot of parallels here. If you look at the representatives of this allegory, if you will, it would appear that the countries that didn't accept Palestine as a nation state beforehand, who are now willing to do so, are doing so because something changed, and the thing that changed was a horrific attack. And if horrific attacks work, well, don't we have a much bigger problem on our hands? But that's the rest of the world. That's what happened over the last, week or so. But I think what's really interesting is a speech that Joe Biden gave on this new kind of deal, which seems to be up in the air. I don't know enough about the internal Israeli decision-making to figure out if the headlines that Israel accepts this new Joe Biden deal, we're just waiting on Hamas. I don't know if that's like an actual acceptance or a calling Hamas's bluff, because every deal that's been put on the table, which obviously includes releasing all of the hostages, Hamas has fervently denied, because it doesn't take a genius to point out the fact that they're not interested in a deal. But anyways, I don't know. What I'm saying is I don't know the strategy going on, obviously, in Israeli internal decision-making. But Joe Biden put together this proposal in which he said two things that I think are incompatible with each other. One, he said Israel has the right to defend itself, which I agree with. And two, he also said that Hamas does not have the ability to pull off another October 7th. And he's using that as a platform in which to try and broker this new ceasefire agreement. Which again, I don't know the internal workings of Israel, whether or not they actually think this is a good idea or whether or not they're calling Hamas's bluff. But the platform that he's using is that, well, Hamas can't do it again. They can't do it again. Here's the problem with that. And here's why those two statements, Israel has the right to defend itself and Hamas can't do that again, are incompatible. One is because it can't be our line in the sand to decide whether or not Hamas is able to pull off another October 7th or they're not. It just can't work if you're also going to say that Israel has the right to defend itself. And I'll get into some of the reasoning as to why that is in a bit, but the bottom line is those two things don't work. If it's our line in the sand, then you can't definitively say that no, Israel has the right to do what they need to do to defend themselves. Because if you're going to go with that approach, you have to make it up to them. And again, I'll explain more in depth why I think it is up to them, and it has to be up to them in a second. The second thing is that also presents us with another problem in terms of support, whether it be weapons, aid, all of the different ways that the U.S. can support Israel. Let's back up. Let's zoom out. The best way to stop the killing and chaos is end the war. I realize that sounds obvious, but then that would mean the most humane thing to do is end the war quickly. And if you're trying to end the war quickly, what do you have to do? You have to win. William Tecumseh Sherman, general in the Civil War, was going down to Atlanta, on his way to sack Atlanta. The people of Atlanta wrote him a letter saying, please don't sack Atlanta. We have homes, we, made all of these cases as to why Sherman shouldn't go and just wreak havoc through Atlanta. Sherman responded with a letter, which I feel like is so poignant to this point in time, especially in this conflict in the Middle East. And he said, the best thing that we can do is end this war as quick as humanly possible. And of course, he's right. The best way to end the chaos, the suffering, the death, is to end the war. And so, if you let up on the gas, especially when you have the upper hand, and this is kind of his statement made in more modern terms, but if you let up on the gas, all you're going to do is prolong the war. If you don't win, you have perpetuity of the war, which is worse for everybody. So Sherman makes the argument to the people of Atlanta saying, look, I sympathize with all of you. I don't want this all to happen, but the most humane thing to do here is to end the war. And the way that we end the war is we win the war. So I will not let up, he says to the people of Atlanta, until the war is won, because at the end of the day, this is better for everybody. And the way that that relates to Israel-Hamas is the best thing that can happen for everybody is this war ends. And the best way that the war ends is Israel definitively wins. As a supporter of Western civilization, I want that to be the outcome. And so regardless of what the Biden administration, what all these other countries around the world say in response to how Israel is winning the war, or how they would win the war, is seemingly irrelevant because it's up to them if, in fact, they do win. And it is in fact, over. And even if we decide to pull our support, that doesn't change the decision-making on their end. That just means they're going to do it in their own way. So it's kind of a conflict in Joe Biden's mind of, well, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to withhold these weapons. In Israel's mind, they're thinking, well, okay, I mean, I guess you can do that, but let's just take, for example, a more targeted missile system. We don't believe this war is over, so if you hold back the targeting weapon system, that doesn't help us end the war quicker, and conversely, it forces us to use dumb bombs, for lack of a better term. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the Biden administration holding back any sort of aid and support doesn't help Israel end the war, which is the most humane thing to do for everybody. The process here is what doesn't make sense, at least in my mind. And that brings us to this. In regards to support for Israel and whether or not the Biden administration is going to pull funding or weaponry or aid or whatever, remember, in this partnership, in this agreement, in this alliance, who is paying the higher cost? Clearly, in all of this is Israel. They're expending money, lives. They're sacrificing as a nation to ensure the fact that they win. So don't you think, wouldn't it make sense that Israel, in this conflict, of all of the nations that are giving input and suggestions and this, that, the other thing, don't you think that they're the ones that want to end this as quickly as possible? Wouldn't that make the most sense? Do you think Israel as a country, who again is sacrificing money, lives, resources, all of these things, do you think that they want this war to continue in perpetuity? No. If there's anybody who wants it to be over, it's Israel. As much as people on the outside of the conflict want to say, we want the war to be over, believe me, you don't want it to be over more than the Israelis. Because again, they are sacrificing more. So then, don't you think that they are going to be the first ones to declare it over if in fact they believe it to be over? They have the most incentive to do so. And considering the fact that they have the biggest incentive to end the war and end it as quickly as possible, given the sacrifices that they're making, don't you think they would? And don't you think that the outside input into this is seemingly irrelevant because the sacrifices that any of the other countries around that are supporting Israel are making don't even hold a candle to the sacrifices that Israel itself is making? And so because of that, don't you think they want to end the war more than you? Whoever you are, whatever nation state is giving input into this, believe me, you don't want this to be over more than the Israelis and the Israeli people. And because of that, you don't get to sit on your high horse and dictate, well, this should be this way, this should be this way, because I want it done. Trust me, they want it done more.